All right. Ouh. Welcome everybody. Bonjour. Bienvenue à Montréal en ce samedi après-midi, the sunny Saturday afternoon in Montreal, for a panel called Other Senses in the Theory track. I'm Thierry Bardini from the University of Montreal. I'll be moderating this panel. We have 3 papers. We'll take questions at the end of the 3 papers. The panelists have been informed that they have 22 minutes each. So we'll start with Dr. Jens HAUSER from the University of Copenhagen. Jens HAUSER is a Paris and Copenhagen-based art curator and media studies scholar. He's focusing on the interaction between art and technology in his research. He holds a dual research position at both the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies and at the Medical Museum at the University of Copenhagen, and is a distinguished affiliated faculty member of the Department of Art, Art History and Design at Michigan State University. He has curated many exhibitions in bioart, among other topics. I'll just name L'Art Biotech at Nantes in 2003, Still Living in Perth in 2007, SK Interfaces, whose catalog you can find on display next door. The article BNL, Transbiotics in Riga, Fingerprints in Berlin and München, and Think Ethic in Vienna in 2011. He'll be presenting a paper entitled Re-Habilitating Bacteria. All right, Jens.
Merci Thierry. Je vais tout de même faire ma présentation en anglais aujourd'hui, donc ce sera plus facile pour la communication ensuite. Alors, bacteria are becoming big and they are rehabilitated and reconsidered in art, philosophy, natural and the health science, and also become omnipresent in art-based research and research-based art. With the scope of what I have been referring to the epistemological turn in art, and especially in art with biomedia, I want to report on trends in this area of what I call microperformativity that are reflected in this new interdisciplinary research platform we have created at the University of Copenhagen, and the label of which is Big Bacteria. So shifting the attention from the paradigm of big data with its sequential data to big bacteria, the platform emphasizes the importance of relational but material concrete networks inherent to coreless single-cell organisms, and calls for a cultural understanding of bodies in general as multidimensional beings and cross-species ecologies. And here bacteria are both matter of inquiry and metaphors for post-anthropocentric self-understanding. One example to start with is, for example, that big data from genetic sequences first showed the presence of formerly unknown bacteria, but now a lot of attention has been shifting to their interaction and the Human Genome Project leading to the Human Microbiome Project, which studies how family members share the microbiota, how microbiota transplants may combat obesity, and how microbial communities affect even our cognitive functions, how missing microbes may be, as Martin Blaser affirms, responsible not only for obesity and allergies, but also for contemporary forms of autism. Logically then, the forthcoming exhibition at the Medical Museum in Copenhagen I'm affiliated with is Mind the Gut. Traditionally, antagonized as invading animals from Pasteur to Koch, bacteria are increasingly understood as collaborators. And in Amsterdam, a bacterial zoo, Micropia, has been opened as part of the Royal Artist Zoo. In my last curated exhibitions, SO3 dealt with 3 significant others, with viruses, bacteria, and bacterial plasmids, as today's science focuses on the benefits of bacteriophages, microbiome studies, or decontaminating bacteria. This is Jim's dog, found in the canyon that Donna Haraway takes as a departure in When Species Meet. So many species, quote, so many kinds meet in Jim's dog, composed by a stem, mosses, ferns, lichens, and bacteria. To be one is always to become many, Haraway writes. Human genomes can be found in only about 10% of all the cells that occupy the mundane space I call my body. The other 90% of the cells are filled with the genomes and bacteria, fungi, protists, and such, some of which play a symphony necessary to my being alive at all. I'm vastly outnumbered by my tiny companions, beyond the mesoscopic individual dog. Through the lens of this role, these artistic practices, I will ask now how these role models ascribed to bacteria oscillate between conceiving of them as workhorses or as complex functioning ecologies, between breeding containers on the one side and actors on the other. We'll also ask how bacteria-related aesthetics, knowledge, and production and the construction of metaphors are intertwined, when, why, and how bacteria serve as media, motifs, metaphors, and models, and how the knowledge about bacteria and aesthetics when employing them entangled, especially given their unaesthetic scale, which often makes technical media necessary. The still valid method of differentiating bacteria, called gram staining, illustrates how epistemic and aesthetic construction goes hand in hand. Developed by Danish botanist Hans Christian Gram, it relies on different color staining of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria depending on the physical differences of their cell walls. And Alexander Fleming is reported to have made his seminal discovery of the antibiotic properties of penicillin thanks to his admittingly less mind-blowing bacterian paintings in petri dishes. His Staphylococci stars in one of his paintings were killed by the rising sun of penicillin. In this short format here today, I just wanted to present a condensed taxonomy of examples how bacteria are being materially used and culturally addressed as symbolic proxies of aliveness, of processuality, as movie actors, as pigments to produce colors, forms, as pathogenic invaders, as aggressors, but also as cleaners, healers, as destroyers or preservers of cultural heritage, as biodeteriorators or remediators, of evolutionary indicators, as learning biosemiotic organisms, also as time capsules for lives in suspended animation, as standardized containers, carriers of genes, but also with relationship to their innate functions as producers, gold miners, energy producers, composers, controllers, but also on bacterial flora as milieu, just the milieu, or as agents of microbial individual fingerprints. In the early 60s, decomposing bacteria were used, such as in Michael Badura's closed biosphere, the sealed world, but less for the sake of the bacteria themselves than to push for an art that resists objecthood and campaigns for processuality, to end, quote, irrevocably the days of the statuary classical sculpture. This is also true for H.R. Schultz's large-scale museum installation, Biokinetic Situations, employing massive amounts of bacteria and fungi conceived as action art beyond the human-centered happening that attacks the very notion of the persistent art object. Here, bacteria produce changes in color and form, employed as and controlled to stage the loss of control. When in 1987, Peter Gavin Hoffman captured microorganisms populating Wassily Kandinsky's Parties diverses and cultured them in a rectangular array of petri dishes, he aimed at shifting organic representation to biological intervention. While choosing Kandinsky as a protagonist of supposedly organic art, the cultivated microorganisms are meant to fulfill promises that the classical avant-garde has finally not delivered. Later, Marta de Menezes, Deacon, picks up Mondrian's request to stage a harmonic equilibrium, but employing on purpose red, blue, and yellow synthetic azocompound pigments often used as dyes and that are banned in the European Union. Here, de Menezes lets Pseudomonas putida bacteria that are used in bioremediation of polluted soils digest the industrial colors. Bacteria deconstruct, decontaminate, and decompose the modernist agenda. In other works, including biotechnological ones employing transgenics or tissue culture, bacteria together with fungi mainly appear as a threat to destroy the actual living artwork through contamination. Jun Takita's brain sculpture covered with bioluminescent moss or the victimless leather grown out of cell lines by the Tissue Culture and Art Project are the actual living and desired artworks which are victims of undesired bacterial deterioration. In retrospect, Eduardo Katz's transgenic installation Genesis appears today as a typical case for art centrally using bacteria but without addressing them. Katz focuses on a synthetic gene generated as a transcription from a sentence in Genesis in the Bible into DNA sequences integrated into E. coli, but the bacteria only indicate the transgenic nature by expressing GFA, but otherwise just remain carriers of the dominant genetic narrative. Indeed, 7 years later, Katz has made bacteria the central agents in a series of light-reactive biotopes, technically constructed as Winogradsky columns with soil bacteria, and that produce specifically designed shapes and letters. Also, in the 80s, artist Joe Davis first uses E. coli to insert extra biological textual or graphic information into the genome, for instance, the ancient rune as a fertility symbol. The bacteria's agency is not acknowledged, they're just breeding containers for the artist's messages. But 25 years later, within the context of today's synthetic biology, with its engineering discourses, Davis' bacterial radio uses here variants of a gene from orange marine puffball sponges to plate electronic circuits that are literally grown by engineered bacteria. The artist takes synthetics biology metaphors literally, but ironically reverses its goal. Instead of applying principles of electronic engineering to biology, he applies biological principles to electronic engineering and forces bacteria to grow a totally anachronistic, old-fashioned radio circuit. This contrasts with the playful extrapolation of bacteria in synthetic biology, especially when students, artists, and tinkerers join for the iGEM competition organized by the MIT, inventing and combining so-called biobricks, while bio-entrepreneur Craig Venter speaks of transplantation when addressing the transfer of a fully synthesized genome into the bacterium Mycoplasma capricolum, which becomes a pure chassis for circuits, models, or standardized parts to be implemented. This vocabulary is much inspired by the concept of orthogonality imported from the computer science, but no longer speaks of organisms or living beings. With Pigeon d'Or, Tour van Balen, Material subverts such metaphors by attempting at making pigeons defecate soap. He has modified the metabolisms of bacteria occurring in the gut of the pigeons with help of biobricks. One is lowering the pH level of Bacteria subtilis, and the other makes it express lipase, so to add no functionalities to animals commonly seen as flying rats. In addition to splicing the genetic sequence into bacteria, Van Balen has tested, by the means of food coloring, how long it takes for transplanted bacteria to replace the existing bacterial flora in the pigeon's gut, hence addressing today's research into microbiome transplantation. Most explorations with biobricks are more techno-enthusiasts, such as Ginsberg's and King's E. chromi, that makes E. coli express colored pigments, supposed to serve as biosensors in home diagnosis. The scatological vector serves as a link to art history. We think of Manzoni or Vaucanson's famous mechanical duck, supposedly digesting grain, or of Wim Delvoye's machines named cloacas in this biosymmetric automata. As we know, the artist has programmed the complex fecal language of enzymes and gut bacteria, but he is also putting a lot of emphasis on the interplay of enzymes to simulate a human digesting apparatus. But the necessary bacteria in these stinking systems remained a blind spot. They're also here just flora or a milieu, media in a very much more traditional sense. The art group C-Lab genetically alters bacteria so they smell like banana. Or they employ naturally occurring magnetic bacteria to construct a living mirror. You may look into a mirror representing the human figure by forcing bacteria contaminating magnetic crystals to express a portrait of individuals. The Indian art group Art Science Bangalore has created teenage gene poems in the form of a biobrick that enables E. coli bacteria to artificially produce geosmin, which is an organic compound responsible for the earthy smell during monsoon rainfalls. This olfactory sensation is connected to the monsoon period as fertile but also melancholic, such as traditionally staged in Bollywood movies. But as Indians know, since the Bhopal gas leak disaster, second and third world countries may be also the first to be exposed to applied synthetic biological agents. So Art Science Bangalore has already developed a kind of DIY kit to detect biobricks in soils. In the citizen science movement, politically motivated projects such as the BioStrike emerge. It fosters open and crowdsourced antibiotic drug discovery through widespread screening of soil bacteria with toolkits sought to use grassroots methods to mitigate the antibiotic resistance crisis. In biohacking circles, hands-on workshops to produce vaginal yogurt are very popular now, taking advantage of the lactobacillus occurring in the vagina to process milk. And Cecil Tola's portraits of individuals' microbial landscapes in individual cheeses, crafted from cultures sampled from the skin of different persons, here point to the fact that since each human body and each cheese have a unique set of microbes, maybe this may be the new fingerprint. When Kathy High aims at becoming David Bowie, she's not taking singing lessons, but attempts to get Bowie's fecal transplant as the supposedly most individual trait. Likewise, Sonja Beumel makes microbial self-portraiture, fingerprints via non-human life forms, while growing her own skin microbes in fully body-sized petri dishes. In contrary, when bacteria only used to become living pigments, their epistemic value often disappears. When, for example, bacteria become movie actors. To advertise Steven Soderbergh's thriller Contagion, living billboards were produced to form the film title as an image not of bacteria but out of bacteria. However, the plot of a viral epidemic is misrepresented here by a spectacular but totally inaccurate bacterial epidemic. By the way, for the use of the same red-colored Serratia matzensis, critical art ensemble member Steve Kurtz was risking 20 years of prison, the FBI having discovered colonies of these harmless bacteria at his home when he prepared politically motivated art actions such as Germ of Deception or the Marching Plate. Other than advertising or political messages, bacteria can also act as messenger media that bridge time and space. Artist Sabine Katrunko has reanimated bacteria cultures from a dust sample from the Sahara Desert brought to Europe by Alexander von Humboldt in 1823. They become, to point to Sigrid Zielinski, messages of deep space and deep time. In Adam Brown's work, the great work of the metal lover, extremophile bacteria employed for the innate natural capacity to metabolize metals. They produce gold, seemingly solving the alchemist riddle of the philosopher's stone. In a bioreactor with a reduced atmosphere without oxygen, these bacteria produce 24-karat gold and can be harvested to create little nuggets. So extremophiles play an important role in our understanding of the origins of life. Moreover, they can filter toxic metals out of industrially polluted soils. In the same way, Gilberto Esparza builds hard, soft, and wetware hybrids. Plantas nomadas navigate through polluted water, driven by energy that bacteria in microbial fuel cells produce while cleaning the water and releasing oxygen. And his plantas autophotosyntheticas present bacteria in microbial fuel cells that produce the energy necessary to power light sources for aquatic plants and to conduct photosynthesis. And if the symbiotic ecosystem is said to express autonomous or intelligent behavior, the latter might not be mimicking the human cognition, but rather the system's decentralized intelligence to clean up humankind's mess. So, in contrast to artistic practices that technically manipulate bacteria to implement new functions, we can see, on the other hand, artists focusing on bacteria's innate technical capacities, which is also the case of artist Edgar Lissel, whose work deals with bacteria's role both in biodeterioration and bioremediation, as well as with the role of cyanobacteria have played in the evolution towards more complexity. Lissel works with phototactic, red pigmented Leptolingba cyanobacteria, that means bacteria which move toward light sources. They can be found in the Domus Aurea caves in Rome, where they degrade the frescoes. Lissel teaches them to reconstruct what they have destroyed by shining the negative of a photo taken from the frescoes onto an equally large plate with gross media. So the Leptolingba bacteria move towards the light and with the pigments constitute a copy of the destroyed wall painting. This is fascinating from a biosemiotic perspective, as outlined by Jesper Hoffmeier, because here we have red Leptolingba bacteria, which cannot live from light alone, unlike the green Leptolingba bacteria, which can fully photosynthesize. But the red ones learn to follow the green ancestors, and they can eat sugars as well, so becoming more independent and increasing what Jesper Hofmeier calls semiotic freedom, an evolutionary sign of complexity of organisms that interpret their environment. Secondly, Lissel's artworks points to the two roles bacteria have in relation to cultural heritage. First as biodeterrogens that cause damages on artworks, but also as bioremediators. Where chemicals or physical removal fails, often bacteria such as Pseudomonas stutzeri manage to clean artworks from undesired biopatinas. This field of conservation and biodeterioration is indeed not just concerned with saving history, but also the starting point for very contemporary art practices. Last September, Sabine Kaczunko sampled living bacteria from the Colosseum in Rome, cultured them live, and projecting their live images back large scale onto the surfaces of the historical building. The reason for that being that it's only thanks to these bacteria that the actual building is still alive. In fact, by a process called biocalcification, the bacteria form crystals to consolidate the stone and making it into travertine, Colosseum stone material. In this interplay of microscopic and macroscopic, we can also see a reminiscence of early microcinematography, such as Jean Camandon's often employing bacteria and embedding them in narratives and anthropomorphized battles between cells and aggressors to provide them with believable agency for their audiences. So to conclude, we can see that bacteria first have served in art as symbolic placeholders for the incontrollable, for processuality. Second, that they have become manipulated tools, but without being addressed as agents as such. And that finally, and in parallel, their inner technical features of a very much greater variety of bacteria becomes acknowledged. So in our working plan for the big bacterial research project, we treat bacteria as epistemic objects, epistemic tools, and also epistemic subjects. And bacteria are organized and organizing, self-producing. They play a role in evolution. They demonstrate variability and adaptability and can be considered also as tool-building agents. And the tool-building argument, the toolmaker argument has always been the most powerful when it comes to human exceptionalism. So to quote my colleague Slavko Kaczunko, these coreless single-cell organisms today build core media and core materials of art and science. They are coreless cores. They may be in our subliminal quest for post-anthropocentric worldviews, a kind of justifying to look back at biologist François Jacob's statement from the 65 from a fresh angle. What is true for E. coli is also true for the elephant. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens. We'll move to our second paper from Dr. David Hause, entitled Coming to Our Senses, a report on the sensory turn in curatorial and media art practice. Dr. Hause is professor of anthropology and co-director of the Center for Sensory Studies at Concordia University here in Montreal. Is also the director of the Concordia Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture and an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law at McGill University. His research projects over the past 10 years have ranged from examining judicial construction of culture to designing performative sensory environment, including some work with Chris Salter from Hexagram. Is currently directing a project entitled Law and the Regulation of the Senses, Exploration in Sensory Legal Studies. Many of the contributions of Dr. Hause are also on display next room. Please.
Thank you very much, Thierry, and I want to thank Giselle and Chris for staging this extraordinary conference, which we have profited from so much in the last while. And what I'd like to do by way of beginning is break the olfactory silence that has been imposed on us by depending heavily on audiovisual media. I'd like to hand around this bag, which contains a herbal sample that I collected in Tucumán in Argentina back in 1992. And this is an aromatic plant. In Quechua, it's called muña muña, which means love, love. And so I warn you, it has both a very powerful smell and a very powerful effect. And indeed, I think that by the end of my presentation, we will all burst spontaneously into the refrain from Love Is All You Need by the Beatles, okay? I think that this will be the effect. So I want to break the olfactory silence, and this is my way of doing that, but please sniff with moderation. I'd like to speak to you about the work of the Center for Sensory Studies, which is based here at Concordia. There are 15 of us in all, and our disciplines range from anthropology, which is my discipline, to psychology, from sociology to art education, and from communication studies to design art. Indeed, Chris Salter is one of the members of the center, but this is just one of his many hats. And I would emphasize that if you go to his house tonight for the party and you look in his sort of, the closet by his door, you'll see 1,000 hats, which are all the many hats that he wears. It's extraordinary, the range of disciplines and knowledges he brings together. Now, our center, the Center for Sensory Studies, is not to be confused with the Sense Lab, which is directed by my colleague Erin Manning. Her concern is with thought in motion, and she's basically interested in crossing philosophy and art, and she takes her inspiration from Alfred North Whitehead. Interestingly, what Erin does is not the philosophy of art, but rather dances philosophy. So not a philosophy of dance, but she dances philosophy. We can keep that going around everybody. Our center's concern is with the sensorium as a cultural formation, and indeed what we are interested in doing is crossing anthropology and the other social sciences and art. So we take our inspiration not so much from philosophy, but rather from Marshall McLuhan, whose picture is on the board, especially his idea of media as extensions of the senses and of cultures as consisting of contrasting sensory ratios. So his idea that thought in oral societies will be more ear-minded and in literate societies more eye-minded is a point of departure, but our researchers have revealed how much more complicated things are than that. But the accent in our work is on ways, as in the title of the latest book by Constance Classen and myself, ways of sensing, or if you like, techniques of perception, and this includes technologies. And I want to emphasize that this word sense actually has a great many dimensions to it and is interesting to ponder. Sense, as in the sense of a word, refers to meaning, but you also sense something, so it has to do with feeling. So here's a word that combines sort of sensation and signification, feeling and meaning, and indeed it enables us to sort of approach a more extended understanding of meaning than we otherwise would. Now, that book, Ways of Sensing, will perhaps recall to mind the classic by John Berger, Ways of Seeing, and I'm glad if it does. I would love to be compared with him, but what we also want to emphasize is that it's all the senses that we're concerned with. Now, the sensory turn that I refer to in my title of my talk started in effect in the late 80s and early 90s. It came after a series of other turns, most notably the linguistic turn, which was very verbocentric, the pictorial turn, which was very ocular-centric, and also the corporeal turn. And I want to emphasize that where the sensory turn differs from the corporeal turn is that instead of insisting on the unity of body and mind, it emphasizes the way in which the senses, all 5 or 17 of them, it's unclear how many exactly there are, both conflict as well as converge. Now, this area of study, which really begins, I think, in the disciplines of history and anthropology in the sort of late earlies and early 90s, has spread across the humanities and social sciences and evidences a whole series of scholars coming to their senses literally and beginning to approach the senses as both objects of study and means of inquiry. Now, hence, sound studies is using listening as a way into understanding the social. As it's spread, it's taken in more and more disciplines, and 2 recent disciplines that it's come to inform include classics, where there has been an explosion in sensory studies in the last while, and also museum studies. And let's call sort of museum studies after the sensory turn sensory museology. Well, I'd like to give you a series of examples of what sensory museology consists of. And I want to emphasize there are two branches to this practice. One has to do with the history of museum display, and the other has to do with the rising tide of sensory engagement and experimentation in contemporary curatorial practice. So, as Exhibit 1, I present to you Sir John Soane Museum, the museum that time forgot, as they say. It's in London, and look at how close everything is, because this museum is really sort of halfway between a cabinet of curiosity and a museum as we would understand it today. But indeed, all of the collections of that time, the museums of that time, in the 17th century, like the Ashmolean, were sort of places where handling was the norm rather than simply viewing. There wasn't the distance to get a good view because you were up next to all these objects all the time. Indeed, the research of Constance Classen has brought out just the importance of exercising all of one's senses and how it was in the early museum. Handling was the norm. And not only did you handle things, but you also sniffed them, and you sometimes chewed them. Now, why would you chew on an exhibition? Well, because at the time, chemistry hadn't been invented, so to really ascertain whether something was acidic or what its properties were, the best sort of sense for doing that was taste. So, in contrast to the modern museum, where you check your senses at the door, the early museum was a kind of sensory gymnasium, a sensory gymnasium. Now, we can go into how the modern museum is above all a temple of sight, and there are numerous ways in which that's true. The hands-off rule, no eating, no running, no singing, no smoking, all of these no's that sort of define the space of the museum. But I want to emphasize that that's changing, and changing rapidly, under the influence of two factors in particular. Not only what artists are doing nowadays, and we saw some of that in the examples of bioart, but also because of the influence of native groups and also the influence of the visually impaired. This is an example of false face masks, as they are called, from the Canadian Museum of Civilization, or now the Museum of Canadian History in Ottawa. These masks would have many ritual uses, including a major role in healing ceremonies. And some say they shouldn't be displayed in Ottawa. They should be repatriated to their community. But the museum, through negotiations with the Haudenosaunee, actually arrived at a compromise solutions. And that was that the masks could continue to be displayed, but they would be treated respectfully, that is, as sentient subjects with sensory appetites. Hence, once each year, some medicine men come to the museum, and there they smudge the masks, and that involves sort of using a smudge stick, so they fumigate them, and also they feed them cornmeal. And what's interesting about that practice is that now that is good curatorial practice, okay? To smoke the artifacts and to feed them is actually the appropriate way in which to interact with them. And another exhibit of what we're calling sensory museology is this project at the McCord Museum in Montreal in collaborative archaeology, led by a student who was attached to one of our projects, Marie-Pierre Gadoua. And what she essentially did was sort of invite Inuit people who came down to Montreal, usually for medical appointments, to come to the McCord at these appointed times. And there they engaged with the artifacts of their culture with no gloves. So these were handling sessions. And what was important about these sessions was the way in which, first of all, uses were discovered for some of these objects that the curators never even imagined. Okay, so that through handling them, it was found that actually the meaning of an artifact is in its use. Furthermore, there was the cultural pride that these people were able to derive from interacting with their material culture, marveling at the wisdom and the ingenuity of their ancestors. And thirdly, all of these interactive sessions were videotaped, and so have become part of the exhibition, so that now you have the object that's been sort of reborn, that is living, as well as the object as sort of trapped in a glass case that is part of the experience. A further example of this sensory turn, another one that's reported on by one of the graduate students attached to our project, is the program called Stimulating the Senses at the National Gallery of Canada. And this involves, first of all, having touch tours for the blind, but it's extended to the general public. And Mark Klintberg, who did this study for us, actually was involved in being blindfolded and feeling this sculpture by Charles Daudelin called Crouching Woman. And then afterwards, he went into a workshop and he was invited to model his impressions in clay. So not to draw them, but rather to model them. And this involves a haptic appropriation of the art, very different from the way in which we typically experience the art visually. Another example that I would like to point to is Displace, which was above all sort of invented by Chris Salter with a team of us. And this, which you will have heard about and which you can read about in Alien Agency, is an installation that is best described as a symphony of the senses. So whereas normally a symphony is just for the ear, actually this was a kind of 5-track performance that Chris designed. The sound was by Tez, there was a taste track by David Santo, and indeed it engaged all 5 senses and more in this kind of symphony. The senses were played, much as one might otherwise play instruments. And you had lights being transposed into tastes, sounds, and smells juxtaposed. This was experimental art of the most exhilarating kind. And significantly, it was staged when the American Anthropological Association was in town. And the interesting thing about it, too, was that it was actually inspired initially by the cultural practices of the Dasana of Colombia, and in particular, the ingestion of hallucinogens, which lead to all kinds of synesthetic visions that is central to the structure of that culture. Hence, the hexagon here is like the phosphenes that the Dasana will see under the influence of ayahuasca. What excited me about this project, in which I was involved as well, was the way in which it presented an alternative both to the ethnographic monograph and ethnographic film. You could actually step inside a culture and experience it through all of your senses instead of the exteriority of those other 2 mediums. Now, this is a site of radical experimentation. The kinds of experiments that Chris does, I think it's far more exciting what he does than what you find in any experimental psychology lab, in fact. But I want to also point to some of the ways in which this drive to engage the senses has actually become part of the mainstream of art. And just 2 recent examples of that include the Soundscapes exhibition that was on at the National Gallery in London. The idea is you hear the painting and you see the sound. And that is manifest, for example, in the way in which there was a painting by Theo van Ruysberg called Coastal Scene, and the sort of electro-dance meister, Jamie XX, was brought in to sort of develop a soundtrack for it. So here, you don't just see the painting, but you also hear it. And the idea is now, sort of art becomes increasingly multisensory. Another example of the same phenomenon was Tate Sensorium this past summer, where an award-winning group of artists inspired by neuroscience put together 4 multisensory exhibitions around select sorts of paintings. This one, Francis Bacon, Figure in a Landscape, involved visitors eating chocolate with a whole series of very interesting traces: edible charcoal, sea salt, smoky lapsang souchong tea, to suggest the painting's dark nature and also the wartime era in which it was painted, while a bit of burnt orange connected to the flashes of color and blue sky. So here, what you find is multiple ways in which the intersensory or the multisensory has become the new norm in art, opening up all kinds of interesting possibilities for creative expression. Now, in the last 4 minutes that I have, I'd like to just talk about some work that we're doing actually this coming week in the center, but above all in the project that is a successor to the project that gave us Displace. For Displace, the inspiration was taken from the Desana of Colombia. We are currently embarked on what is called the Sensory Entanglements Project, again directed by Chris Salter, and this one with support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And in it, what we are concerned with doing is comparing the artistic and communication traditions of the Aboriginal Americas, both North and South, with those of Aboriginal Australia, and then mixing those traditions, both with each other and with new media or digital art, to see what kind of art results and what kind of communicative possibilities this new form holds. Now, I'm not going to talk about the quipu, a fascinating mnemonic device that was used by the Inca, but other than saying this is a multi-sensory recording device of extraordinary power that rivals any cell phone in terms of its dimensionality, but that's for another talk. What I'd like to do is just address briefly the area that I'm working on for the project, which is exploring the aesthetic potential of smoke as a medium. And so I've had one of my research assistants actually look at, well, how does smoke figure as an artistic medium in Western artistic traditions? And recently there's been the idea of singing underwater, for example. Juliana Snapper performs opera underwater, and really there's a very different quality to the sound, as you can imagine. But what about smoke? What are its potentialities? Has that been used? Unfortunately, there were very few artistic experiments involving smoke. Most of the discussion was either about health and safety concerns and how, Du Maurier, which used to sponsor, this is a tobacco company, art events should get out of that. And so, it was very, sort of in that regard, not seeing any good in smoke whatsoever. But another research assistant, Jessie Masumi, had asked to look at Native American traditions. And there we find a rich tradition of smoke being used. And indeed, smoke as a communicative medium is extraordinary. And the thing I want to emphasize is its multisensoriality, its smell, its taste, and also its sound, because always smoking is accompanied by drumming and also by chanting in Aboriginal traditions. And its use for spiritual purposes, above all for connecting with the Creator. And I'd just like to close by emphasizing the importance of this kind of investigation to understanding cross-cultural relations. This is an image of a treaty process, and you'll see that the Europeans are either sitting or standing in a chair, sitting or in the chair or standing, and one of them is actually reciting the terms of a treaty, which is of course written. But on the ground, there's a chief with a pipe that is being offered to another member of the European Party, and this is the way in which to create a binding agreement in native tradition. Two different forms of communication, two different levels of communication, and now in this time when many treaties are being reopened because there was not an understanding, not a meeting of minds when they are negotiated, we have, I think, the opportunity to explore these other systems of communication, sensory communication, and just what they contained, and that has both political and aesthetic implications. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, David. Now for our last paper, we have a trio performing. First, Dr. Michael DARROCH from the University of Windsor. He's the director of In Terminus, Center for Art, Media and Urban Ecologies, and a co-investigator for the Visible City Project plus Archive at York University, an external research associate for the Canadian Centre for German and European Studies, and a member of the Centre de Recherche sur l'Intermédialité here in Montreal. Dr. DARROCH's research explores Canadian and German theories of media and materialities with a focus on practices of media and art in a variety of urban contexts. His current research project explores the history of Marshall McLuhan and Edmund Carpenter's Culture and Communication Seminar and Explorations Journal at the University of Toronto in the 1950s. He will be accompanied by Hart Cohen, who is an associate professor in media arts in the School of Communication Arts at the University of Western Sydney, Australia, where he is also the associate head of school responsible for research and postgraduate studies. And finally, Paul Heyer, who is a professor in communication studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. Who's speaking first already? I forgot. Paul. Sorry.
I'll just say, Paul will speak first, followed by me. I just wanted to say merci beaucoup. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici. C'est la troisième fois que j'assiste au colloque Media Art Histories. Donc, pour tout le monde dans notre équipe, on est très content d'être ici. We're going to speak in English, but this is a first instance when we speak together as part of a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant. And so I'm going to let Paul go, and then I'll speak and leave it with Hart.
Okay, I'm going to begin with a very short introduction to Carpenter and his work. A very personal introduction because I was a student of Ted Carpenter. And then let my fellow conspirators here do the heavy lifting with some of the materials. During the 1950s at the University of Toronto, a project and journal was born called Explorations. It yielded one of the 20th century's great experiments in interdisciplinary research. It brought together contributors from the humanities, social sciences, and the arts, both national and international. And Mike's going to elaborate further on some of the dimensions of this project. At the center of this creative vortex were two men, Marshall McLuhan, whom I assume needs no introduction, and Edmund Ted Carpenter, anthropologist, very interested in the senses and doing pioneering work in that area, which will come out shortly, filmmaker, media analyst, public intellectual, an extraordinary person, and the driving force behind exploration. It's a remarkable legacy which we are endeavoring to excavate and bring to light with this project that Mike mentioned. My connection to Ted was direct. After being inspired by his writings during my undergraduate days at what is now Concordia University, it was Sir George Williams back in my day, having been led to that work through citations in McLuhan, I was inspired to pursue graduate work in anthropology and went off to the New School for Social Research in New York. It never dawned on me that I would ever meet or have the opportunity to take courses with Ted, but it happened. I knew he was a maverick, a global soul, to use Pico Iyer's term. He could be anywhere, New Guinea, Siberia, Switzerland, California, his last known academic abode. And I had no idea what he looked like. So I took a course called Anthropology in Modern Life when I was at the New School. And the instructor was listed as TBA, to be announced. It's always iffy. You never know what you're going to get. It's like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates, right? And he comes in and says, my name's Carpenter. I said, well, coincidence, Carpenter, not an uncommon name. Just call me Ted. But I didn't know he went by the name Ted at that point. And I said, well, Edmund can't be Ted. You know, it's not him. Until he began to speak. And then I recognized the same insights and lyricism that characterizes his writing. I found my fellow students didn't know who he was. And I said, good, more of him for me. And so it was over the following 2 years. When I was studying with Ted, he had just completed his photo essay, They Became What They Beheld. We have that up there? Yeah? Okay, great. An unusual glimpse of American culture at the end of the 1960s. He was also finalizing what is probably his most important and representative work, Oh, What a Blow That Phantom Gave Me. It explores Ted's unconventional approach to anthropology, something that Hart's going to elaborate on further, as it seamlessly moves between ethnographic insight and the media-saturated world of high and postmodernism. Both works build on, explore further Ted's examination of mediated realities years before post-structuralists began dispensing the term simulacra. Ted was way ahead in this back in the 1950s. Part of his approach entailed developing something that we now call medium theory, as opposed to the more content-oriented media theory. Although it wasn't called medium theory back then, and I don't think Ted ever subscribed to the term. But by and large, that's a lot of what he was doing. He outlines the approach in an essay from Explorations called The New Languages, a really, really important statement, which is reprinted in the anthology he did with Marshall McLuhan, Explorations in Communication, that came out in 1960. His approach drew from linguistic anthropology, particularly applying the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis used in the study of language and culture to examining the properties of various media from print to television. By the way, he always insisted on calling this the Sapir-Whorf-Lee hypothesis because he had a great regard for the anthropologist Laurier Lee, whom he collaborated with on a number of occasions. Now, in so doing, there's another side of Ted that sort of reemerged in my own work many years later. As a collateral effect of his work in medium theory, he was exploring what we now call adaptation studies. This is a big field. In the last 2 decades, there are journals, and everybody's interested in you're transposing from one medium to the next. And Ted was doing this going way back into the 1950s. He often showed how a given narrative, when it's encoded in different media, is often reconfigured to suit the properties of that new medium. And that we shouldn't necessarily privilege the medium of origin, especially when comparing, let's say, a book to a film. Now, this is widely accepted today, but back in the 1950s, the book was almost invariably privileged over the film. And Ted, one of the things that I gathered from his lectures, and he never published much in this area, but he talked about it a lot, was book-to-film transpositions, and which ones worked and which ones didn't, and so on. And so, for some crazy reason, this lingered in my mind. 30 years later, I began doing serious work and writing on Orson Welles. And Orson Welles adaptations, stage, radio, film, television. And it was that experience with Ted way back when that sort of reawakened an interest in that area. And then off I went in another area that's not quite anthropology, but it's certainly medium theory. And I argue that Welles is a medium theorist. Now, in this approach, and I'll just sort of end with this lovely quote, far from being a medium determinist with his approach to what we now call medium theorist, Ted provides this beautiful statement of what he was trying to get at. And when I read this, because I had 2 years to experience him in the classroom, and when he spoke, it was very much like his writing. And when you read his writings and you know his voice, you hear his voice in your mind's ear when you read his writings. And when I read this in my hoarse, fading voice, Ted will definitely resonate in my mind's ear. Certain media favor, while others do not, certain ideas and values. More simply put, each medium is a unique soil. That soil does not guarantee which plants will grow there, but it influences which plants will blossom or wilt there. So with that, I'll just pass it over.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So I would like to contextualize Carpenter's writings on the Inuit Inuit art forms that he was engaged with in the 1950s and 60s as part of his contemporaneous studies of media conducted with McLuhan and others. As an opening to interpret the character and quality of images that we have recently had the privilege of finding in an unfinished film from the year 1958 and 59, a collaboration with cinematographer Fritz Spies, which was to be called Eskimo Art. And in the final section of our presentation, Hart will offer commentary through some specific sequences of this film. We're obviously aware of the many usages of the term Eskimo, and of course it was the term that he used in his lifetime, and so we'll refer to his work with the term Eskimo as we go through our presentation. After early apprenticeships and introductions to archaeology and anthropology, Carpenter undertook a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and he studied with Frank Speck, which is interesting because Speck himself was a student of Franz Boas. Carpenter would move towards a strong focus on art, theater, and performance, the hallmarks of Boasian cultural anthropology. And there's a strong link to Carpenter's main focus on art and craft of the Iverlik, on the dynamic and sensual character of masks, as well as on language in the service of poetry. In many ways, Carpenter's approach to medium theory emerged from his experiences living among the Inuit communities that he worked with on the northwest coast of Hudson Bay, of what is now Nunavut, Canada, where he twice wintered from 1950 to 1953. In a series of essays throughout the 50s, he described these experiences through analyses of time-space concepts in poetry and art. As Paul has noted, he also worked for the CBC in the late 40s and 1950s. He would soon join Marshall McLuhan and the 3 other scholars in a Ford Foundation grant at the University of Toronto on new media and behavior from 53 to 55. He was not only the project's co-director, but he helped found the journal Explorations and acted as its chief editor for issues 1 to 6 and its co-editor for issues 7 and 8. Now, I've presented on the history of explorations at previous iterations of the Media Art Histories conferences, so let me just say that the Ford Explorations project, to my mind, emphasizes a comment made yesterday, I believe, by Georgina Bourne regarding interdisciplinarity and a commitment to retaining the specificities of disciplinary practices while searching for common vocabularies. This was a sentiment embraced by this group's decision to develop, as they would say, an interdisciplinary study as an area of mutually supporting insights in a critique of their different disciplines. For Carpenter specifically, this meant, as he would put it in a tentative outline for explorations, a new study in both anthropology and communications. And I should note that having worked with the McLuhan and Carpenter estates for some years now, we're actually on the verge of republishing Explorations, which wasn't quite ready for this conference, sadly, but I hope it'll be out this fall. So keep your eyes open for a book launch. This was a sentiment embraced by the group's decision, excuse me, let me continue. The search for a common vocabulary to engage with new media of the 50s was also filtered through town planning and architecture. And one of the colleagues was Jacqueline Thierry, who was a British town planner connected to Bauhaus, and whose longtime collaborator Siegfried Gideon was also connected to the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne. Gideon's cultural histories of spatial paradigms, architecture, and mechanization were a major influence on the group, and his ongoing work in the 50s on prehistoric art led to a series of exchanges with Carpenter, which is informative for his goals in the film. In '59, Carpenter carried his model of integrated anthropology and communication pedagogy to California when he took up a position as chair of the anthropology department at San Fernando Valley State College, initiating an experimental program combining anthropology, visual arts, film production, ethnomusicology, and jazz performance. As a department chair during the Cold War and at a time when the National Defense Education Act was providing unprecedented funding for media research and education, Carpenter enjoyed an academic freedom to experiment that he would never replicate. And it's between these two pedagogical projects in Toronto and California that he developed the bulk of the Eskimo art film. In his various writings and republications of Inuit stories, Carpenter frequently referenced the film and photographic work of Robert Flaherty. He was particularly enamored of this sketch by an anonymous artist, Inuit artist, from about 1914, portraying Flaherty in 3 simultaneous acts of filmmaking: directing, setting up, and shooting. The image here reinforced his belief that Inuit worldviews and experiences lent themselves to the analysis of new media as multiple simultaneous viewpoints. In 1959, Carpenter edited Explorations 9, the 9th issue, as Eskimo, juxtaposing elements of his writings on the Inuit with works by Flaherty and with Frederick Varley. And it was reprinted by University of Toronto Press the same year. This volume included multiple still images of objects that are found in the film, some collected by Flaherty, as with this image of a ring of joined figures held at the Royal Ontario Museum. The development of the film and the production of Explorations 9 are really extensions of the same project. The film consists of 108 sequences depicting a range of artifacts, both still and in motion. Carpenter was keen to make the film dynamic by the movement of both the objects and the camera. In the mid-50s, he began to write about space concepts of the Ivelik, and later sharing many of these drafts with Siegfried Gideon. Here, Carpenter lays out an interpretation of carvings that clearly informs his filmic aesthetic. In Ivelik art, each experience is confined to its own space-time life, without reference to wider spatial relationships. For the most part, visual representations are limited to single spatial units. Their comprehension is not connected with the understanding of the surrounding space. Each element lives in spatial independence. Gideon took special interest in Carpenter's manuscripts, annotating segments that intersected with his own book projects, The Eternal Present, The Beginnings of Art and Architecture. Ivalic art is dynamic, Carpenter argues, in overlapping and simultaneous forms. At times, when figures overlap, they are endowed with transparency. An egg may be shown inside a bird or a child in a womb. Two wrestlers may be stretched with 4 arms showing. This transparency implies more than an optical characteristic. It means the simultaneous perception of different spatial locations. Gideon would resurrect notions of transparency in interpenetration, or what he had called Durchdringung in German, to describe methods uniting primeval and contemporary art. Anthropologists, Gideon notes, have dubbed this X-ray. In contemporary art, it has become an accepted practice. Carpenter also notes indigenous methods of art making as X-ray pictures used to penetrate and make visible objects hidden from the eye, and thus to show the spatial unity of things. In a letter from 1958 to Gideon, Carpenter drew his attention to a knife with a depiction of a grazing caribou, noting that if you turn the sheet 90 degrees counterclockwise, the caribou stands upright, watchful. An illustration Gideon was absolutely enamored with and would incorporate into the internal present. This sense of multi-perspective in motion is tied to the notion of an ecology of sense that pervades Carpenter's work and would be particularly inspiring to McLuhan and the explorations group's development of the notion of acoustic space. As Carpenter would explain to Gideon about his own book and film projects, skip forward. In photograph and in layout, we tried to reflect the spirit of Eskimo art in motion with multi-perspective. Thus, we would take a single ivory carving and with a black background get various exposures at different angles and distances, juxtaposing and superimposing. For the explorations researchers, his incisive anthropological explorations of the Ivalic gave the notion of acoustic space its keenest historical grounding. His experiences living amongst the Ivalic in the early 50s had a resounding influence on his own understanding of the interplay of the senses, nonlinear patterns, as well as time-space interpenetrations of humans and their environments. As he would later recount, earlier I'd wondered if Plato's and Aristotle's hierarchy of the senses enjoyed counterparts in tribal societies. Did each culture possess a unique sensory profile? Why was sight so often muted in tribal art and dance? Was non-representational art direct sensory programming? Acoustic space offered a clue. The final unit of entry in Explorations 8, which was a kind of tribute to acoustic space and James Joyce, which was titled No Upside Down in Eskimo Art, if I can find it, was really a response to Gideon, who had asked whether prehistoric artistic aesthetics were now reappearing in the imagination of contemporary artists. Carpenter and McLuhan surmised that a new ecology of sense was emerging in contemporary electric culture, a simultaneous and immersive technological environment that could potentially be interpreted through the lens of multi-perspectival approaches to art making among Arctic peoples. And here I'll turn over to Hart.
Thank you, Michael, and just let me say I'm really privileged to be able to speak at the conference here. It's a wonderful conference, and particularly with my two colleagues who I hold in high esteem. My hook, and the reason I'm here is because I've been working in another archive, not the Carpenter archive, where we've been for the last little while, but the archive of TGH Strello in the Strello Research Centre in Central Australia. The hook for me in the Strello archive was a film collection of about 25 hours. So when I was invited to, I think it was a session that Paul organized around Carpenter to make a comparison between Carpenter and Strello, I was quite moved to find many points of contact between them. They were both renegades, they were recalcitrants, they were anti-anthropologists. In fact, the last essay in Oh, What a Blow That Phantom Gave Me was Misanthropology. So there was a lot that resonated for me around the Strello space in Carpenter's persona and practice. I should also say that I think when I joined the team, I was expected to find traces of Carpenter in Australia. He, in fact, ended up in New Guinea for a considerable length of time, making very comprehensive film works there, not finished as such, but nonetheless quite coherent. The trace in Australia was actually a little bit more obscure. He was commissioned by the Australian government to produce a report. He got quite cynical about that process and instead wrote, Oh, What a Blow That Phantom Gave Me, I haven't found the Australian response yet to that book. I imagine they weren't particularly pleased. The hook also for me, very interestingly, as Michael pointed out, was that Carpenter had a link to Boas through Speck. The interesting thing with Strello also is that he was much more Boasian than British structural functionalist in the Radcliffe Brownian Bruno Malinowski tradition. So we have a connection there between, if you like, Boas, Strello, and Carpenter. So what I'm going to do for as much time as I've got left is begin to showcase, I guess, if you like, the film annotation tool that is in its very early development. And here I should also channel the very interesting work presented by Monica Kin-Gagnon's idea of posthumous cinema. I think we're in that space with this particular work. This work called Eskimo, of course we would use the term Inuit now, is Carpenter's attempt to begin to think about a film. And I think that's about all we can say. He was certainly interested at some stage. We even have in the archive some very sketchy notes. And let me just read the opening, if you like, treatment for this work. Imagine landscape footage, bleak, windswept ice fields and snow wastes. Eskimo in blizzard. And the narration comes in, Canada, north of Hudson Bay. Men have lived here for thousands of years. It's a hard land. The earth never thaws. Nothing grows. The mystery is not that men should be tossed by chance into this desolate waste. It is rather that within this prison of ice and wind, they are to draw images from themselves powerful enough to deny their nothingness. For me, I just immediately began to imagine Nanook of the North and the opening sequences of Flaherty's film. And as Michael's already alluded to, Carpenter channels Flaherty quite a lot through that period. So we have in this work, if you like, mostly, I consider them to be quite static shots of Inuit carvings. And the annotations that we begin to source against these carvings are drawn from various writings of Carpenter, letters, as already illustrated, publications, and certain parts of these very sketchy film scripts. So we can annotate these annotations, and have we gone past the man-wolf one yet? Okay. So for the annotation that's against the man-wolf, which is quite an interesting one that's drawn from the actual treatment, we can also say that the image contains a man and a wolf, their relative positions dictated by ivory. Each may be viewed independently or seen together. Turned thus, here is one relationship, turned another, something else is involved. And so, if you like, we have, I think, a sense there that the conceptual and philosophical understanding that Carpenter has of Inuit art is in a sense thematized all through this idea of multi-perspectival creations and approaches. We can say that the annotation sort of extends the idea that there is a particular ethos pervading the making of Inuit art that is much more biased towards process than product. So Carpenter writes, in Avilic art, experience is confirmed as to its own space-time life without referring to wider spatial relationships. Michael's already alluded to the notion of transparency, the superimposition of different configurations without harming or obliterating any of them, the portraying of the inside and the outside simultaneously, that we see as well. We've taken the term ecology of sense to describe the conceptual approach. I think it resonates well with David's earlier paper that Carpenter uses to frame Avilic art, and the term, I think I first encountered it from Professor Donald Theall, the supervisor of my master's thesis, a student of Carpenter's, and also from the work of Gregory Bateson. Further annotations here, we find that again, I think resonating with David's version of handling is the norm. Carpenter writes, the Inuit, the Eskimo wanted these forms to move, and the Eskimos make these forms move. They'll pass them pass them around, stand them up, knock them down. They'll imitate the cries of birds. The fun was in the carving and the releasing of the form and welcoming it back and then passing it around again. So this sense of continual movement and engagement with these objects. Carpenter attributed the inspiration for making the film to a man named Ononuk. He states, this was someone who I was very close to, and I would think that most of the insights, I wouldn't say they came from him, but without him, they wouldn't have happened. I'm not sure I understand the difference between those things. I think there's a whole lot more we can investigate and interrogate about Carpenter's relationship to the Inuit people that helped him in his field work. And finally, I think with the form of acoustic space that emerges, there's, I think, a sense that this wasn't just Carpenter's idea and McLuhan's idea. Carl Williams, I think, first wrote the paper calling it an auditory space, not acoustic space. But Carpenter revises Williams' work, and he writes, among the Eskimo, there is no silent sculpture. Idols are unknown. Instead, deities are masked dancers who speak and sing. When the mask speaks, it contains meaning and value. Silent, static, illustrated in a book or a thing in a museum, it's empty of value. And then he goes on to say, hearer would it be a better term than seer for their holy men. It's a good place to end, I think. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It made me feel like recycling a sentence from a letter you projected. How very kind of you all to be so punctual. We have now ample time for questions, actually 15 minutes. I don't know how we proceed. Is there a microphone? Yeah, there's a microphone here and another there. If we have questions, it's time, people. You could have question among you. There's one. Can you move to the... You're right in my back, so sorry.
This is a question for Professor Howe. Thank you so much all for a wonderful, wonderful panel. Professor Howe, I'm interested in your in the work that your group is undergoing, and I wonder to what extent you're involving Native groups in the, in the projects that you're doing here and with Australia.
Yes, so this coming week, 2 Aboriginal artists from Australia and 2 from Canada will be sort of coming in to Montreal, and our workshop will be going on for 10 days at that time. So I've been responsible for looking into the archive, trying to sort of get at the history of Native white relations and understanding other forms of communication in the societies. But the whole point is precisely that this is going to be a meeting of Aboriginal artists, many of whom are new media artists and new media artists, and it's going to be exploring, again, the potentialities of Aboriginal art that in some cases, transcend even the most advanced technologies that we have here. So it's very much an intercultural sort of environment that we've created, and there will also be a time when the Canadian group goes to Australia. So it's all based on cross-cultural exchange, very much. And if I can just make a point about your wonderful excavation of Ted Carpenter and all that he represents. He was indeed an anti-anthropologist. It took us 30 years to catch up with him, and so the anthropology of the senses, such as it's practiced now, is actually sort of trying to work through the implications of what he and McLuhan were doing. So they were out of time, and we're just beginning to understand the implications of their work now, and I'm so delighted to hear about the archaeology that you're doing in terms of bringing this back to the table. These ideas of ecology of sense are really fundamental to us now and are only possible in that way.
Yeah, I have a comment that you'll probably enjoy. One of the things that he did was give us examples of indigenous people who defined seasons by the sense of smell of particular plants that came into bloom at that time. And also, he strongly advocated, but I don't think any of us took it up, he said, you should learn to read Braille. It's a different experience.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go to the microphone? Can you hear? Excuse me, can you go to the microphone, please? Thanks.
I wanted to ask Jens, I wanted to ask Jens a question. I was quite fascinated by your discussion of bacteria as epistemic objects and the variety of examples that you gave. But I wanted to push a little bit the problem, which I see as a contemporary cultural problem, between, let's say, the extreming that occurs in synthetic biology labs, and how you begin to distinguish that from what's happening in, let's say, the art sci research that's going on from people like Suzanne Anker. I mean, this whole business that you wonderfully outlined. But I think somehow that portion of the picture needs to be addressed. That is the kind wheeling experimentation that produces a stuff, if you will, that has no purpose, even avant la lettre, and certainly not after. So anyway, I just want to throw that out. And it was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there are two answers that are quite practical to this question, because the last two residency for artists that we have been able to set up is actually the first one in Denmark at the Flint, at the Center for Fundamental Living Technologies, where we had an art and science call. So we have placed the Turkish artist there who is working with proto-cells, basically. So it's not top-down biobricks, just basic extreme genetic engineering, but it's actually kind of more chemistry-based approach to produce edible proto-cells for social interaction. The second example is in UC Irvine. We have also just been able to create a project of artist in residency in synthetic biology, but taking also epistemically based projects in. So Anna Dimitriou, for example, is the first artist in residency having worked with what is called the kill switch when it comes to xenobiology and exobiology, and how you may enable systems to have a kill switch to disconnect from systems. And the second artist, they are going to be invited there, work on simulating phytoplankton as ecologically resilient indicators, but to simulate them with protocells. So even I think in this very fancy realm of synthetic biology, where all the engineering discourse is very, very highly branded, I think the artists that are able to investigate these fields have a kind of critical epistemological gestures. So I don't know if this answers the question, but I feel that the artwork that is emerging within this field of synthetic biology is going much beyond just tinkering or applying biobricks to matter that we can see very often in the item competitions. No?
Hello. Sorry. My question, I guess, is to the three last speakers, to Hart and to Paul. It's very interesting because, you know, in the 90s, and I guess through the early 21st century, there was this kind of discursive confrontation between Inuit makers and Flaherty's work, where essentially, and Zach Canuck was probably the most important artist in that space, where, you know, he basically looked at that work as being a fiction that was a performative, you know, relationship between the Inuit and the anthropologist. So I'm really methodologically curious to, you know, as you're looking at Carpenter, how to, you know, think through, given the kind of contemporary incredible richness of Inuit art right now, and there's a whole new generation of cultural theorists in the North who are kind of looking at that and positioning that history with, you know, anthropological practices. It just seems that, you know, it requires some level of that dialogue, and like looking at Emily Carr and her relationship with the men and women who kind of opened the doors of the forest to her. And so I'm just curious about, you know, because you've got a SSHRC grant and it gives you some time to look at the layers of exploration, how you're thinking about that problematic. And I'm not asking that to be confrontational. It's just, you know, as you talk about the work and his reflections, which are, you know, positioned in a particular moment in time and have some amazing ideas in it. I'm also Gerald McMaster, who's now at University and is, you know, a really major scholar there in this space, is doing a whole set of work looking at how the Inuit were looking at white people. I mean, he has this global project looking at how Indigenous people look at the kind of colonial encounter from the Indigenous perspective. So just sort of curious about where they're going to sit in the work.
Well, I'll get a first stab. I think my sense is that the history of ethnographic film and visual anthropology has a long and I think series of debates that would put into question certainly the relationships that obtained between either people like Flaherty or other visual anthropologists through most of the 20th century, and that would also include the person I've been working on for quite some time, T.J. Estrello. I think the sense of where Carpenter sits is a kind of interesting place. It's a very unusual situation to have someone who could be criticized quite heavily for some of the opaqueness around the relationships that he developed with people that he worked with both in the North and in places like New Guinea and possibly the United States, though I knew less about his relationships there. Those are key and have been examined critically for a period of time. But the other side of Carpenter, of course, is that he himself was critical of what was going on around him, both within and outside anthropology. So you have this rather unusual situation of being able to, I guess, critique someone for his own kind of lack of certain kinds of at least making explicit what sorts of relationships obtained for him, and at the same time to somehow situate that critique within the larger critiques around representation within and outside anthropology. I think of visual anthropology, ethnographic film, as having a similar kind of problem, that it, in some instances, was often never accepted within traditional anthropology for a long period of time, even when Margaret Mead decided to support the idea of the visual. But in another way, of course, one could find those critiques quite lively through the period when it became a form of, well, another form of, I suppose, misrepresentation or domination. So I think it's very complicated, and I hope we can, in some way, sort through those things. Michael?
I can add a point to this. Carpenter was very disposed toward an experiment, John Adair, through Navajo Eyes, where the people who were trained with the camera and told us to go out and film, what kind of perspective would they bring? And Carpenter was very favorably disposed toward that.
I think Hart and Paul have already covered quite a bit of ground there. Thanks for the question, Sarah. But for us, this is really an opportunity, I think, to start exploring the very questions that you're posing, because we had the opportunity kind of suddenly, I think, to jump on this archive, which was becoming available, and after Carpenter died in 2011, and his papers are sort of in the process of being archived right now, and so we were able to insert ourselves into that debate and kind of hit the jackpot with our grant. But we see this as an opportunity to collaborate with all kinds of other scholars and artists. So we're just embarking on what this can turn into.
It's a bit low. I just had a question for Jens, and apologies because I went to the other session after Jens's. I haven't got a question for anybody else, but in Jens's talk you mentioned an unaesthetic scale.
Excuse me?
You mentioned an unaesthetic scale.
Yes.
And so I wanted to know what an unaesthetic scale actually looks like or was.
Well, knowing your nano work, Paul, I mean, this is very tricky question to answer because all your personal work is, of course, was making very small scale phenomena visible, right? I think what I was referring to is this unaesthetic scale is very much the difficulty of grasp phenomena through the senses of our mesoscopically underdeveloped human bodies, and therefore open it up to kind of sensory question in how far microscopic and macroscopic bodies, swarms, but also bacteria become aesthetic tools to have other aesthetic vectors than those proposed by the prolonging of audiovisual data capturing devices. And we know also that, and that's why I was very happy to hear about more this olfactory efforts that are being made. As you have seen, a lot of these bacterial artworks are very much concerned with smell and taste, actually. Haptics is more tricky for evident reasons of pathology. But there is a strive also to overcome this kind of audiovisual trust that is also a kind of form of anthropocentrism. So I think that this anesthetic value that I wanted to elaborate on a little bit more is that very often we only have these issues being raised through microscopy. And there are artists increasingly not just wanting to representing on a visual scale what's happening there, but really enlarging the scope, sensing in how far microscopic tools. That's why also this microbial fingerprints are interesting, or ecologies that are related not only to how we mess up our internal but also our external ecologies at the same time, and so questioning the sensory apparatus of phenomenological limitations. I think that is also a question that is very central in your work.
Hi, I just wanted to comment on the last two papers, and what I'm about to say may sound a bit, but I hope it isn't taken in that spirit. But I think what's interesting is, however important and interesting the work of people like Carpenter and McLuhan, and it is undoubtedly of enormous interest, and I value the projects, a risk of addressing their work without bringing, as it were, the contemporary conceptual armory that we have into our reassessment of their work. And that could go along with a kind of romanticization of a certain era of anthropology, which itself was fallible, had problems. And so, I guess I want to kind of encapsulate that issue by asking something, which is a question to David and to you, which is about the sensory turn. And that is, are the senses the same for everybody? How do we understand the imbrication of the senses and social relations, whether they're gendered or raced or of whatever kind? And it seems to me that today, if we talk of the senses, there's a of a certain universalization, which is disturbing. We have to ask the question. And this is, of course, not just about scholarship, but when the sensory turn moves into practices in the way David gave us a beautiful set of accounts of, dare I say it, even in Chris's wonderful installation work. So I think this is, a core question. It's something that is absolutely, I think, we know now, not there in that generation of work, but we can't escape this question. So it's not meant to be an aggressive question, but it is meant to say, when we recover the incredibly interesting lines of thought and imagination that we've lost, which is very valuable, we also have to readdress them from the point of view urgent questions today. So.
Thank you very much for that question. I think that one thing that I would say about the anthropology of the senses is precisely that those critical questions of politics, the politics of the perceptual, are absolutely central. They were not for McLuhan, who often sort of racist psychologists for his data, and the whole point of the kind of anthropological field work, but also the artistic experiments that we've been doing has been to foreground the political. I tried to allude to that in terms of looking at smoke as a medium of artistic expression. Why is it excluded from contemporary representational forms when it's a form that was so fundamental to many Aboriginal societies and has communicative potential that I think we need to begin to recognize. So I would absolutely agree that the politics is at the center, and what hierarchy of the senses means, what different hierarchies means, the gendering of perception. These have all been central to the kind of work that we've been doing now, which are questions that were not being asked in the 1950s. At the same time, I think that, precisely we can open up our understanding of art through engaging across cultures with sensory expressions. And it's in that regard that what I was gesturing towards was not just a media art history, but a sensory art history. And indeed, as we have more and more work being done in that area, we find a very rich array of understandings emerging across the field.
Well, I mean, I'll start, although maybe you have other comments. I don't find that an aggressive question at all. I think it's an excellent question. And we are in exactly that predicament right now with this work. So I think, again, it's more of an opportunity than anything to take up the challenge of asking those questions as we go forward. Our first task in many ways was to open up the papers in the archive and see what's there and find things like this film, among other things. But there's no question that as Hart indicated earlier, we think Carpenter is an interesting case because he is contradictory in many ways. He becomes quite a wealthy collector later in life and would spend a great deal of money, paying for art objects. When in an earlier phase of his life, he, of course, was quite extraordinarily critical, vehemently critical of the Canadian government's attitude towards creating a new art market, essentially, for Inuit art in the 60s, which may actually have something to do with why this film was never finished. We're not really sure about that yet. But it really wasn't until the 70s when he himself took up a much more political stance towards the kinds of questions he had been asking. And so we're hoping to use those kinds of questions as a springboard as we move forward to ask the very questions that Dr. Bourne was posing.
Yeah, and just be brief, I also appreciate the question very much, particularly within the perspectives of ethnography and anthropology. I think the sense for me is that we're a multi-stage kind of project, and the first kind of encounter is kind of with the archive and with the writings and other representations by Carpenter. And it would seem to me that it's kind of a sense of, in this sort of early stage, trying to in effect, almost embody a bit into his head and think a little bit along the lines of what he might have been thinking and working with conceptually. That said, undoubtedly one would have to make a move, I would think, fairly quickly towards understanding where the edge of critique would lie with respect to that work. I think back to, again, my own kind of perspective on Strello and encountering a culture of anthropology and collection that was driven by what was then a scientifically acceptable theory of eugenics, not that long ago in effect, and only really recently rejected, and even concepts of race that I guess one could still find that one would think were outmoded. So I think conceptually, I guess we're at the point of understanding the moment, the historical period, even the language. He uses Eskimo, we would use Inuit, and other examples of that kind of ideological space within which he was writing and engaging his material, and we have to kind of move beyond that point at some stage.
Yeah, when I had Carpenter as a teacher at the New School, that bed of critical theory and Marxism and the whole 60s phenomena, and I think he was quite uncertain as to how to relate to that. Students would say, well, these works of art were gathered at gunpoint by British colonial, and he kind of never really came to grips with that. I think the world was changing, and I don't think he was able to really make the kind of connections that we would ask him to make today.
I should also note that it's not at all lost on us that we're three white guys sitting up here talking about these issues. I should mention that one of our team members is Janine Marchessault at York, who couldn't be with us today, so we're not a totally male project. But it was a great concern for us when we were writing the grant. We talked at great length about it, and we just had a short time and an opportunity because of previous collaborations to put it together. So we mean it quite earnestly when we say it's an opportunity for collaboration with Indigenous scholars and artists and others. because we're not sure we can do it on our own. And well, maybe I'll leave it there, actually.
Maybe I could just say one final thing. Maria's wonderful paper yesterday showing various sightings where there were parallel developments in South American art to those which are celebrated, which are in European art, was a really way of opening up us to multiple histories. And one of the main points of the paper by José Carlos Mariátegui on Francesco Mariotti was precisely how the multi-sensory dimensions of that extraordinary installation were under-theorized. And so the sensory turn to theorize those works and trying to understand them as part of other trajectories. I think that one of the things that both the work of Carpenter and this work in sort of sensory studies does is open us up to multiple histories in a way that is not just the traditional trajectory of art history. So bringing in and bringing other cultural influences in has broadened the discussion and multiplied the basis of discussion in some really important kinds of ways.
Maybe just a word on how I understood the critique of romanticization, something that is also very much linked to the methodology that we employ with cultural and epistemic objects. I was within the line of the conference theme of media art history is very much surprised, and how, for example, this morning Josia Krisa reported on this curatorial research as research labs and to investigate media art history and epistemological history from a kind of contemporary artist point of view and going back in deep time and space in different forms that are just purely academic and working with archives, which is very much what academics do. So I think it's very important to have this kind of experimental epistemological settings in labs as well and curatorial research of them, not just to have interdisciplinary research, but also have very undisciplined research.
Thanks for the panel. I am Jeremy from Brazil, and you talked about sense and Latin American art. So I have experience in expanded sensorium researches. I have also a project with MIT Media Lab regarding engineering sense. So what we do now in terms of go ahead with this work that my colleagues they showed yesterday. For example, we did for the Biennale of Cuba, there were anthropologists working together and also people from rituals, Mesoamerican rituals, and engineers and artists. And what we do rituals using Mesoamerican rituals, and also the idea of serpents that I talked to yesterday. Like the name of the work was Biohybrid Ouroboros, the geographies of the ecstasy. So we tried to put the body in contact of, in a state of ecstasy, and we have sensors. With the engineers, they built the sensor, the Cuban engineers together, for learning together, to doing together in a collaborative practice on art and science. And we did also the visualization of the energies of the body using GRS, galvanic sensors, and breathing sensors. So our goal is to know what are the levels of biological rates we have. Because I work on biomedical engineering with people, and this kind of art work can be transposed for biomedical engineering and disabled people and other things. So this is one experience that I would like to show you, to tell you about. No, but we work with electrical engineering, anthropologists, artists, dancers, you know.
I think there's some wonderful research in science. I guess what anthropology focuses on is practices, and it's art practice, but cultural practice that is above all concerned us. So that what we're concerned with doing is finding out, what the range of possible sensation is. And increasingly, anthropologists have not only been going across cultural boundaries, but also sort of species boundaries, doing an ethnography of the life of cells, doing an ethnography of others. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I'm really sorry. Sorry, Thierry, tu peux faire la fin, s'il vous plaît?
I was just saying maybe you could continue this conversation during the break because we're a bit over time now. So it's time to conclude. Thank you very much, everybody. That was a wonderful panel.